Imagine walking into a new job, eager to make a difference, only to be crushed by hateful and racist looks. Chloe experiences this on a daily basis at St. Mary's Hospital, especially from a doctor who couldn't see anything beyond the color of her skin. Would you have the courage? Chloe took a deep breath before crossing the automatic doors of St. Mary's General Hospital. The weight of that morning overwhelmed her. In her mind, she repeated the words she had heard so many times from her mother. "You're strong, Chloe. You'll make it." That's what she needed to believe. But the atmosphere around her was already beginning to reveal another truth. The strong smell of antiseptic, mixed with the constant sound of rushing footsteps and hospital machines, was familiar. But this time, everything seemed different. She held her badge tightly, still shiny, a small mark that she had arrived there on merit. However, as the minutes passed, the feeling of being watched, of being unwanted, grew like a shadow around her. She didn't need anyone to say anything. The stares spoke louder than any words. When she passed through the corridor, the groups of nurses stopped talking for a moment, and she felt the weight of their eyes on the back of her head. There were no smiles, just a silent appraisal, as if to ask, "What is she doing here?" The white walls of the hospital, once impersonal, seemed suffocating. Every step echoed in the empty corridors, as if announcing the presence of someone who shouldn't be there. Every turned face, every muffled whisper, confirmed what she had feared. Chloe was alone in that environment. It was as if an invisible barrier had risen between her and the others, a barrier she knew well, but which no one dared to admit. The first interaction came from a blonde nurse with cold eyes, who approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Chloe, right?" she asked, her gaze studying her face from top to bottom. Chloe confirmed with a slight nod, trying to hide the discomfort in her chest. The woman's gaze was clear in its judgment, as if Chloe were a piece out of place. It didn't take much to realize that the smile hid contempt. As we made our way through the wards, the tension continued to grow. The hospital looked like a stage, with everyone watching their every move. She heard muffled laughter in the distance, discreet whispers that always seemed to end when she passed by. She knew, even without words, that she was being rejected. There was a feeling of isolation, as if everyone there already agreed on an unspoken truth. She didn't belong there. With every glance, the discomfort grew more acute. The floor seemed harder, the corridors longer. At one point, she crossed paths with Dr. William for the first time. He looked at her as if she were transparent, his cold, distant gaze offering no welcome. It was as if, for him, Chloe didn't exist. That simple look, or the lack of it, was a blow that delivered the clear message: "You don't belong here." Chloe tried to stay focused. She tried to remember why she was there, her mission to look after people. But the atmosphere around her was suffocating, relentless. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. Every little interaction, or lack of one, reinforced the feeling that, in that hospital, her presence was not wanted. She moved away, looking for a corner where she could breathe without being observed, trying to pull herself together. But no matter where she was, the discomfort followed her, like a shadow clinging to her steps. When Chloe reached the nursing ward, her shoulders were already tense, as if she were carrying an invisible burden. She took a deep breath and tried to disguise her discomfort, but nothing could prepare her for what was to follow. Right away, she saw the man they had been talking about, Dr. William. He was standing in front of a group of doctors, talking and laughing at something someone had said. He was tall, thin, with a look that seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who crossed his path. Rumors ran wild in the corridors. He was one of the most respected surgeons in the hospital, but also the most rigid and ruthless. And, from what Chloe had heard, he didn't like newcomers very much, especially newcomers like her. Without much choice, Chloe approached him. She needed to introduce herself, show a willingness to learn and work as part of a team. But as soon as she got close to the group, the atmosphere changed. The laughter subsided, and the once relaxed looks turned cold and evaluative. She knew what that meant. "Dr. William," she began, trying to keep her tone firm, even though her throat was dry. "I'm Chloe Parker, the new nurse." He turned slowly, looking her up and down as if he were analyzing a foreign object. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Every second without an answer was an extra weight on her shoulders. When he finally opened his mouth, the contempt in his voice was impossible to ignore. "Ah, yes," he said, with a tone that sounded more like a joke than an acknowledgement. "The new one." He didn't say anything else, didn't hold out his hand, didn't show the slightest interest. He just turned away, as if her presence didn't matter. Worse still, the other doctors with him exchanged quick glances, and one or two laughed, low but loud enough for Chloe to hear. She stood there static, trying to absorb what had just happened. The blood was pounding in her temples and her heart was beating heavily in her chest. The message was clear. She was not welcome. Dr. William didn't have to say it in so many words. His attitude made it clear that, for him, Chloe was nothing more than an inconvenience. Chloe tried to get on with her day, to concentrate on her tasks, but Dr. William's presence seemed to follow every step she took. Even when he wasn't physically near, she felt his shadow hanging over everything. It was as if he had decided from that first glance that she had no place there, and each encounter only confirmed it. Later during her shift, Chloe saw him again. He strode down the corridor with his firm gait, handing out dry orders to the other employees without even looking at her. And every time he appeared, the same discomfort returned. It was as if, in her mind, she was already doomed. Any mistake, any slip-up, would be yet another excuse for him to prove he was right about her. Chloe knew she had to be strong, but at that moment between cold stares and silent judgments, the tension seemed overwhelming. Chloe's shift became heavier as the hours passed. She forced herself to maintain a professional attitude, not to let the cold stares and hushed comments of her colleagues get to her. But every interaction with them seemed to sap her energy. There was no camaraderie, no support. It was as if she was a stranger, an intruder, who no one wanted around. Things got worse when she entered Mr. Johnson's room. He was a middle-aged man, balding with a constantly sour expression. Right from the start, the older nurse had warned her that he was difficult. But Chloe knew what that meant, and it didn't take her long to find out. As soon as he walked in, with a professional smile on his face and his chart in his hands, he looked at her out of the corner of his eye, not even hiding his contempt. Chloe approached, trying to follow procedure. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vital signs. May I have your arm, please?" He snorted, crossing his arms and sinking deeper into the pillows. "You? How am I supposed to trust a newbie like you to look after me?" Chloe swallowed. She was used to rude comments, but something about the way he said it, with his judgmental gaze, made her stomach turn. She kept her cool, reminding herself that she was a professional. She took a deep breath and tried to continue. "I'm qualified, Mr. Johnson. I'm here to make sure everything is all right." He looked her up and down with a contempt he made no effort to hide. "Qualified? You may be a nurse, but do you think I trust someone like you to look after me?" Those words hit Chloe like a punch. She forced herself not to react, but inside his every comment was an open wound. What he really meant was clear as day. He didn't trust her, not because she was new, but because of who she was. Chloe stood her ground. She continued the examination, measuring Mr. Johnson's vital signs while he continued to mutter nasty comments, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. Every second in the room seemed to drag by. It wasn't just him. The whole hospital seemed to be working against her. In the cafeteria during a short break, Chloe sat alone in a corner, trying to gather her strength for the rest of her shift. The other nurses were chatting animatedly at a nearby table, but they didn't even bother to invite her. One of them cast a quick glance at Chloe, whispered something to her colleague, and they both laughed. It hit her hard. It was always like that. A whispered comment here, a wry look there. The whole hospital seemed to conspire to sideline her, as if she wasn't one of their colleagues, but someone who simply shouldn't be there. Chloe took a deep breath, looking down at the cold coffee in her hands. She knew she couldn't let it get her down, but every day was becoming a battle. Even so, Chloe refused to give up. She was there for a reason, a higher purpose. Caring for the patients was what mattered. What she faced inside that hospital was cruel, yes, but she knew she was strong. And no matter how much the stares and comments weighed her down, Chloe clung to that strength, holding her head high, even when everything around her tried to pull her down. The hospital seemed like a fortress of hostility, But it was on an ordinary afternoon, after a particularly heavy shift, that Chloe found a little refuge. She had just seen Mr. Edwards, an older man with a genuine smile, and the kind of warmth she hardly believed existed in that place. He treated her with a kindness that, until then, she hadn't felt from anyone there. As he adjusted the pillows and checked her vital signs, he watched her with an attention that carried no judgment. It was just respect, a kind of respect she no longer expected to receive. "You're the new nurse, right?" he asked, his voice husky but firm. Chloe nodded, not dwelling too long on her answer. She had learned to be practical, not to expect good interactions in that hospital. But Mr. Edwards kept talking, and his words cut through the cold silence she had been dreading. "I've heard a few things about you," he said, with a half smile on his face. "I just wanted you to know that I admire what you're doing here." Chloe, taken aback, looked up. He was watching her with a sincere expression, his blue eyes bright with age but full of understanding. For a moment, Chloe didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to receiving words of encouragement in there. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she replied, her voice a little softer, feeling the weight of his words. "It's been challenging." He let out a short laugh, but not one of debauchery. It was the laugh of someone who understood the difficulties of life, of someone who had already faced his own battles. "I can imagine," he said with a sigh. "You must be strong to be here, facing all this. They may not see it now, but you make a difference." Those words entered Chloe in a way she hadn't expected. All the weight she had been carrying since the first day, all the cold stares and mean comments seemed for a brief moment to dissipate. Someone in there, in that hospital, saw her. Someone saw beyond the color of her skin, beyond the veiled prejudice. In the days that followed, visits to Mr. Edwards became the highlight of her shift. He always welcomed her with that same warm smile, always had a word of support, as if he felt she needed it. And she did. It was as if those conversations were the relief Chloe so desperately needed, a little breather in the midst of the storm brewing around her. He talked about life, about his experiences, and listened to Chloe with an attentiveness that no other person there offered. More than a patient, he had become a kind of confidant, an unexpected ally in the midst of so many silent battles. Chloe began to realize that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Mr. Edwards, with his simple, direct words, helped her remember that she had a purpose there. Even if the hospital tried to break her, even if Dr. William and her co-workers gave up on her, she wasn't willing to give up. After all, someone recognized her value, and at that moment, that was enough to keep her flame burning. The hospital was at its usual pace. Patients coming and going, the incessant sound of monitors filling the air. Chloe was used to the intense routine, but that day, something put her on alert. An emergency was announced, and she was called into the operating room. Her heart raced, not just because of the seriousness of the situation, but because she knew who would be there: Dr. William. In the room, the atmosphere was pure tension. The patient, a middle-aged man, was in critical condition. Chloe, alongside other nurses, was preparing the equipment when Dr. William entered. He didn't look at her directly, as usual, just gave quick, dry orders to the team. Chloe tried to shake off the discomfort. The focus was on saving that man's life. Everything was going according to protocol until, while monitoring his vital signs, Chloe noticed something alarming. The patient's oxygen level began to drop too quickly. His face, previously just pale, began to take on a blue hue, indicating that something was seriously wrong. "Dr. William, his oxygen levels are dropping rapidly," Chloe warned, trying to keep her voice steady, but the urgency was palpable. William paid no attention. He just carried on with the procedure as if nothing was happening. "I know what I'm doing," he replied with a tone that mixed disdain and impatience, without even turning his head towards her. But Chloe knew that wasn't right. That man was on the verge of collapse, and she couldn't just stand there, watching silently as everything crumbled before her eyes. She moved closer, watching the numbers on the monitors drop. The pressure was mounting, but she couldn't let Dr. Williams' pride put that life at risk. Every second counted. Chloe knew that if she didn't act, the patient wouldn't stand a chance. "Dr. William," she insisted, this time more firmly, "we need to increase the administration of fluids now. or he won't make it. The silence in the operating room grew heavier. Everyone stopped what they were doing for a brief moment, sensing the tension between the two. William turned slowly, his eyes pure fury. "Do you think you know more than me, nurse?" Chloe felt fear creep up her spine, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. It wasn't about her. It was about saving that life. She knew she was right. "Please," she insisted, her eyes fixed on the monitors. "Look at the signs. He's decompensating. If we don't act now, he'll die." For a second, Dr. Williams' gaze wavered. He knew the numbers were there, but his pride still held him back. Chloe could almost see his internal battle, his resistance to accepting that she, the rookie, the nurse he despised so much, could be right. Finally, with an abrupt gesture, he gave the signal. Fluids were administered, and the monitor, which had previously shown a dangerous decline, slowly began to stabilize. The patient's breathing normalized, and color began to return to his face. Chloe took a deep, relieved breath, but the relief was short-lived. She knew that what she had done would not be forgotten or forgiven by Dr. William. He looked at her with even more cutting coldness than before, his lips tight. "You were lucky this time," he murmured softly but loud enough for Chloe to hear. "That doesn't change anything." Chloe didn't reply. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done there. She knew she had saved a life, and that no matter how much he tried to diminish it, was what really mattered. The days following that surgery were suffocating. Chloe knew that by defying Dr. William, she had crossed an invisible line. Now the tension that had previously hung in the air seemed thicker, more oppressive. Every time he passed through the corridors, there was an uncomfortable silence. The nurses and doctors avoided eye contact with her, as if they feared being seen too close. It was as if Chloe had committed a crime, not by saving a life, but by daring to stand out, by having the courage to do what he didn't want to do. Soon, Dr. William began to intensify his pursuit in a subtle but relentless way. Every little mistake, no matter how insignificant, became grounds for public reprimands. If a procedure took a minute longer or a document wasn't exactly where it was supposed to be, he would call her in for talks that were, in fact, veiled humiliations, always with that controlled but cruel tone that only he knew how to use. On one such occasion, he stopped her in the corridor, just after a long shift at work. Chloe was exhausted, but tried to keep her composure. "Chloe, do you think your work is satisfactory?" he asked with that cold stare, without giving her a chance to answer. "Because it seems to me you're a bit inattentive." She knew it was personal. It had nothing to do with his work, which was impeccable. But he wanted to break her, and with each new onslaught, Chloe felt the fatigue building up. The internal resistance she had tried so hard to maintain was beginning to wear thin. Yet even in the face of this constant pressure, she didn't let her feelings show. What was happening there went far beyond just professional disagreements. It wasn't just Dr. William. He had created an environment where the other staff also felt comfortable belittling her. The nurses, who used to just whisper, now made low jokes in her presence, comments about her appearance, about how certain people didn't know their place. One morning, Chloe entered the restroom, and the atmosphere immediately cooled down. The conversation stopped, and all the nurses glanced at her. One of them, Jennifer, purposely raised her voice. "Some newbies need to learn that the hospital is no place to attract attention. You know, we're here to do the right job, not to promote ourselves." The others laughed, and Chloe felt her blood boil with anger and humiliation. She knew it was about her, but she pretended not to hear. She had to. She couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. But inside, she was on the verge of exploding. At home, when Chloe took off her uniform and looked in the mirror, the weight of it all finally fell on her. There were days when she wondered if it was all worth it. Every day in that hospital felt like a struggle, and she was tired of fighting. Her mother's voice, which had so often given her strength, sounded more distant now. Chloe wanted to believe that she was strong enough, but the constant pressure was leaving marks. Not physical ones, but internal ones. Marks that she carried alone, with no one to vent to. But even in the midst of so much despair, there was something inside her that refused to give in. There were days when she arrived at the hospital determined to prove, not to them, but to herself, that she had a right to be there. She knew the battle was unfair, that the cards were marked against her, but there was a flame that still wouldn't go out. The day seemed like any other. Chloe, tired, went about her routine at the hospital, but the weight of the hostile environment made each task more arduous. She was holding back, fighting that constant feeling of being on trial. Dr. Williams' comments echoed in her mind, and the muffled laughter of her colleagues was still ringing in her ears. However, something was about to change. Chloe made her way to Mr. Edwards' room for her usual visit. He always welcomed her with that genuine smile and a word of comfort, and that day Chloe needed it more than ever. But when she entered, she noticed something different. The air seemed more tense, but it wasn't because of Mr. Edwards. He was sitting on the bed, his posture firmer than usual, a glint in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Chloe," he said in a stronger voice than usual, "I need to talk to you about something important." She felt a knot forming in her stomach. During every visit, they always talked about life, about the difficulties she faced in hospital. But at that moment, there was a seriousness in the air that made her go on alert. Before she could answer, the door to the room suddenly opened, and to her shock, Dr. William walked in, accompanied by other doctors. He looked at Chloe as if she were a nuisance, as he always did, but this time, there was an extra tension in his expression, as if he knew something was out of control. "Chloe, what's going on here?" Dr. William began, his voice sharp as usual. "You shouldn't be here right now." But before Chloe could even try to understand what was going on, Mr. Edwards intervened. "Actually, Dr. William," he said, his voice firm and authoritative, "I think I'm the one who needs to ask this question. After all, I am the CEO of this hospital." The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe could barely process what she had just heard. Mr. Edwards, the man she had treated like any other patient, was actually the boss of the whole thing. The man she thought was just a confidant was actually the one who had the power to change everything. Dr. William paled. For the first time, Chloe saw the look of superiority and arrogance disappear from his face, replaced by pure panic. "What?" Dr. William muttered, trying to keep his composure, but clearly shaken. "What do you mean? You're the CEO." Mr. Edwards got out of bed calmly, but there was an authority in his every move. He completely ignored Dr. Williams' presence and addressed Chloe with that same look of respect that always made her feel seen, valued. "Chloe," he said with a slight smile, "I want you to know that I've seen everything. I've seen how you've been treated here, and it's unacceptable. Your skills, your courage, you deserve so much more than this." Chloe felt a wave of relief and emotion so strong that she could barely speak. It was as if, suddenly, all the weight she had been carrying since the first day was beginning to dissipate. Someone finally saw. Not only saw, but had the power to do something about it. Mr. Edwards then turned to Dr. William, who now looked smaller, more insecure. "William, what you've been doing here won't continue. I've seen the way you've treated Chloe, and your conduct with other staff has also been reported. As of now, you are suspended, and an investigation will be conducted into your practices at the hospital." Chloe watched as Dr. Williams' face fell. He no longer had the superiority he once displayed. Now he was just another man who would be held accountable for his actions. And the relief Chloe felt at that moment was almost indescribable. Years of frustration, humiliation, and resistance now seemed to be paying off. Mr. Edwards turned to Chloe again, his eyes full of understanding. "You are no longer alone in this. Things will change, and you will be part of that change." At that moment, Chloe felt that justice had finally begun to be served. The days following Dr. Williams' suspension brought a palpable change at St. Mary's General Hospital. Chloe felt the atmosphere around her transform, as if the air, once heavy with hostility, was finally beginning to purify. However, what happened next took Chloe by surprise in a way she could never have imagined. She was called to a meeting with Mr. Edwards, this time not in the hospital room, but in his office. The same man she had treated as a patient was now summoning her as a leader. As she entered the room, Chloe was still processing the new reality. Ever since he had exposed her true position as CEO, Mr. Edwards hadn't stopped reinforcing how important she was to the change that was about to take place there. Sitting in front of him, Chloe listened attentively as he explained the proposal. Chloe, he began, his voice low but warm, what you have faced here is not just an isolated issue. What you experienced was a reflection of much bigger, deep-rooted problems. And we need people like you to put that right. She blinked, trying to understand what he meant. Mr. Edwards leaned forward with a look that mixed seriousness and hope. I want you to take up the new position of Director of Diversity at the hospital. You will be responsible for ensuring that situations like the one you experienced don't happen again, to anyone. Chloe was shocked. The words echoed in her head. Director of Diversity? Her? After all the suffering, the humiliations, the looks of contempt, now she was being asked to lead a cultural change. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. There was a mixture of emotions inside her. Disbelief, gratitude, a little fear, but above all, a deep sense of justice. It was as if, finally, everything she had fought for was being rewarded. She looked at Mr. Edwards, who was watching her patiently. He knew that this offer carried much more than just a new position. It was an invitation for Chloe to transform the place that had almost broken her. I accept, Chloe finally said, her voice firm but her heart racing with emotion. I want to be part of that change. Over the next few months, Chloe plunged headlong into her new role. Every meeting, every workshop she led on diversity and inclusion was a small victory. And every time she walked through the corridors of the hospital, she felt the difference. The looks of disdain disappeared. The same nurses who laughed behind her back now greeted her with respect. There was a long way to go, but the small changes were already visible. Chloe felt empowered knowing that, rather than surviving the toxic environment that had once suffocated her, she was now responsible for changing it. She had become the voice of so many who, like her, had been silenced. One day as she was walking through the corridors, a new nurse, clearly anxious, bumped into her. Chloe noticed the nervousness in the girl's eyes, the same insecurity she had once felt herself. She stopped, gave a warm smile, and offered her help. This was what was now part of her routine, making sure that no one else felt the way she did. Alone. Invisible. At the entrance to the hospital, a new sign had been installed. She passed it every day. But at that moment, she made a point of stopping and reading it carefully. St. Mary's General Hospital, a place of care, respect, and inclusion for all. Chloe smiled. The weight of the past was still there, but now it seemed lighter. She was no longer the nurse who walked in silence, trying not to be noticed. She was a leader, a strong voice in a place that was finally starting to change. Justice, so long awaited, had arrived, and Chloe, after everything, was exactly where she had always deserved to be.